Oh, okay, you guys are live.
Okay, hi everyone. Welcome. Thank you for coming to our online panel today about The Witcher and Slavic mythology. Thanks to the High Fantasy track at DragonCon for sponsoring us. My name is Rebecca Fant. I'll be the moderator today. I'll go ahead and let everyone introduce themselves. I'm just a big fan of The Witcher. I enjoyed the books, the games, and now the show too. And so I'm really happy to be here as a fan and talking to you guys about the mythology and the Slavic mythology of The Witcher. So we can just go around and introduce ourselves and tell us a little bit about before we get into the content. Kirsten, do you want to go first?
Sure. Hi, I'm Kirsten. It probably says Green Dragon on the screen, and a lot of folks from the High Fantasy track will know me from my work with the OneRing.net, where I'm a senior staffer and I go by Green Dragon there. I love participating in the High Fantasy track every year and all the different topics that come up that I'm like, oh, I'm particularly excited about that. And as far as The Witcher goes, I'm a pagan myself and particularly interested in the history of European witchcraft and witchcraft traditions. So I love looking at how those influence the books, and I'm excited to talk about that today.
Awesome. You want to go ahead next, Seth?
Yeah. So my name is Seth. I'm a huge fan of The Witcher. If you guys could tell from doing the Witcher panel yesterday with Rebecca. Played the games, read all the books, kind of stuff for it. And once I read the books and kind of like read the games, I started getting into the folklore a little bit. Because I feel like, the more Eastern European you get, the weirder things get. So I kind of felt that rabbit trail all the way down. Filming from the beautiful mountains of Mordor today. That's stuff for it. That's it. I'm just a huge fan.
Awesome. All right, Bethany?
I'm Bethany Kesler. I am a historian and folklorist in my spare time. And I kick around the internet often as Dorothy Joan Gray, which is my pen name. But yeah, I'm actually here because I really, really love mythology and folklore. And I came to The Witcher pretty late. So I've only ever seen the show, but what I saw there was pretty fascinating. So I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm happy for all you guys to be here too. So let's just dive in and go ahead and just kind of start talking about Slavic folklore in general. Is it underrepresented? What are the basics of it? Whoever wants to chime in first, let's go for it.
I mean, it is and it's not. The thing about The Witcher is that it's also written from someone who is living and breathing the Slavic mythology, because there are a whole bunch of books that have been written by Western authors featuring different parts of Slavic mythology, but for someone from that country, from that area to be writing it, it's and to have it then translated into English, because oftentimes it's the reverse.
Mm-hmm.
So that in and of itself is super, super special, because we don't have a lot of that, and we need more of it. And hopefully this will be the thing that gives it the push that we get more of that kind of thing. But yeah, this is kind of a rarity.
Yeah, I would say it's very underrepresented right now, just because a lot of people won't know the difference between Western and European mythology kind of stuff. Because when someone says Baba Yaga, they immediately think, oh, Russian kind of stuff. But then you have the wild hunt that is, there's a German wild hunt, there is a Norwegian wild hunt, there's the Slavic and Russian differences in the wild hunt. And you don't see I think specifically Slavic. It's more kind of just, all conglomerated into one, and there's no real separation in there.
Yeah, and then you've got the Celtic, British, Irish, Scottish flavors of the wild hunt.
Mm-hmm.
And some of that just comes back to what we think of as Celtic mythology restricted to a region is actually incorrect, because the Celts went from Ireland all the way up through Belgium and further. There are bits of Celtic mythology all over both Western and Eastern Europe. We just tend to focus on the shiny trinity of Ireland, the UK, and Scotland.
Yeah.
Scotland is part of the UK. I just
Oh.
feel obliged to say that because I'm actually in Scotland at the moment. Not picking on you at all. I just feel obliged to say that as I'm not a Scotland
Fair
independent.
enough.
Anyway, but I think I'm really interested in what you guys are saying about that, because what's fascinating to me about the Witcher tales is what a patchwork they are. And it's exactly what you guys are saying, like about how Celtic myth is spread throughout, and you know the tales in The Witcher, yes, they do weave in very specific Slavic fantasy creatures and fantasy tropes, but a lot of it is just in general Northern Hemisphere fantasy and mythology in a much wider term. It's a real patchwork of those different strands, and you see a lot of traditional fairy tales from across Europe woven into the stories that are, you know, French fairy tales, Brothers Grimm collected fairy tales that have been woven into the tales of the Witcher, and then added in this particular flavor of the Slavic tradition. So it's very interesting to me the way those different threads have been kind of braided together in here to perhaps maybe to bring Slavic ideas to an audience who aren't used to them by mixing them in with the more familiar Celtic and French, etc. fairy tale mythology.
Well, yeah, and I think that's probably a really, really good analysis of that. I mean, the best way to get a cat to try new food is to mix it in with the old food for like a week and stuff. So yeah, no, that I can see where that would be, mix this in a little bit to make it a little more palatable. And the fairy tales, I mean, even though we think of them as like German and French fairy tales, a lot of them are much older than the people who we know collected them.
Mm-hmm.
So there are like 300 at last count, which gets a little weird because, you know, folklorists can't agree on anything ever. There's between 200 and 500 versions of Cinderella, and
Right.
certainly the oldest we know of comes from the Grecian area, if I recall correctly. I'm still working on my first cup of coffee, guys. Sorry.
That's okay. No, but I totally agree with you guys that it seems really smart on Sapkowski's part to kind of insert the Slavic flavor, like you were saying, Kirsten, into things that we already know. So we can kind of follow along, but then we have these twists that kind of introduce us to a new mythology, a new type of folklore.
I also think it's
my interest.
What's interesting to him, right, as a writer, because the first time when I was reading The Witcher, like the Last Wish, that original collection of in a way short stories, although it does all hang together as a tale, I was fascinated. I was like, did this guy come from a witchcraft background? You know, I wanted to know his biography. Was his grandmother a witch? Or, you know, I used to date a Polish guy, and I'm pretty sure his grandmother was a witch. Somebody told me. But I was proud, you know, and then I looked at his biography and I was like, oh no, there's nothing to suggest that that's his personal background. It's just what is interesting to him. And I think that, again, to him, he's interested in all these different tales. The ancient ones, like Bethany was just talking about, the more modern, like Beauty and the Beast as an example of a more modern 18th century French fairy tale, blah, blah, blah. I think he's just taking everything that's interesting to him. And don't you think the most successful writers are the ones who write about what they find interesting rather than trying? And I know he said himself, I'm a businessman, I know what sells. And so he sort of claims he wrote a story that he believed would sell. But I feel like he also just wrote what he was interested in himself. And that made it compelling.
Yeah, and as a writer myself, that's the smartest way to approach it, is to write what you want to write and then find a way to make it marketable afterwards. So, I mean, and yeah, because I mean, my own fiction is a huge amalgam of Arthurian mythology, Celtic mythology, Hindu mythology. Like I was a very nerdy kid who read a lot of books, and So a lot of this just, seems natural. I did love, and this is going to be slightly hilarious, but I did love that we get elves that aren't Tolkien ripoff elves. We get elves that are like a lot closer to some of the oldest stories of elves, and that was really interesting, especially the way they were portrayed in the show. That was very, very cool.
Well, and that might be a good segue, Bethany, into what I wanted to talk about next. And it kind of ties into something Seth and I were talking about yesterday on just the season 1 review panel, is that when you first see the elves, when they're introduced in the show and in the book too, most of the time we're used to these fantasy stories of good versus evil. The underdog will rise up and prevail. Whereas Geralt straight up tells the elves, like, you guys need to move on, go somewhere else, give up this fight. Like, that way you can having families and live your lives and survive, rather than go down in some kind of blaze of glory that you're not going to win. But I just wanted to introduce the part that one of the key things of Slavic folklore is that it kind of has a bite more so than some of the Western counterparts. It focuses more on individuality, some darker themes are thrown in there. So I think that's a great segue if we want to talk about that in terms of The Witcher as well.
Well, talking like for the bite, like, I played the games, and, when you first see the Striga, I'm like, oh, they ripped off of a vampire and they just changed the name kind of stuff for it. And then I finally read Last Wish, and I'm like, holy crap, there's this whole side of the folklore that I didn't really realize. And that's what got me hooked into, especially the Beauty and the Beast short story. I know I mentioned that like twice last night, but that was my favorite of the short stories because it's completely different from the Disney version. It's completely different from the Grimm version kind of stuff for it. And, it's that kind of led me to thinking, that there's a lot of difference for it. And then you do have the elves that are different. And it's a great hook of the greater good individuality kind of stuff for it. And, lesser of two evils, greater good kind of stuff for it.
And you kind of see that reflected in the show a lot, because the show keeps coming down is Geralt has kind of like a code of ethics that he follows, that he's like pretty adamant about following, and only steps in, like the scene I'm thinking of right now is at Pavada's betrothal, where, he keeps refusing to step in for Calanth, but when she starts going after Dooney, he steps in to help protect Dooney because Dooney's done nothing wrong. So that really does kind of tie back into just what you two were saying, that it is very much a, individual kind of, this is my code of ethics and I'm not compromising this for anyone. Like, I don't care what happens. So it's a really interesting tack to take, especially in this day and age.
And do you think that comes particularly from a Slavic point of view then? Is that what we're saying with this, that individuality is a particularly Slavic flavor?
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm saying. Not that you can't see that in other places as well. I found this quote just when I was researching some of these tales a while back that I thought was really good, and I can read it.
The Foundation guy.
He said, it's from David Waldron, and he said, Slavic tales have a distinct ideological difference to Western science fiction and fantasy. Battles between good and evil and opposing ideologies in general are seen as inherently destructive. You find the ultimate values being placed on the immediate kindness, integrity, and compassion to those around you. Ideologies tend to suppress that for the greater good, which I think you totally see in the way, like, as soon as I read that, I was like, that's why I wrote it down. Is just because you totally see that where they go from kingdom to kingdom, everyone kind of sucks to varying degrees, and they're mostly just trying to do the best they can in a situation for the people that they care about in their immediate vicinity.
And then there's Nilfgaard.
And you have several monsters or, mythos that are like that too. Baba Yaga is a good example of, she's not evil as portrayed by some. It depends on the kindness and integrity and the compassion that you show towards her for what she shows to you. And same with the Leshen, the ancient forest spirit, kind of stuff. Or kind of like the Miyazaki films that, if you treat him with kindness, he's not going to just murder you and your whole family.
I have Totoro right here. Look, my earrings are Totoro.
Those are really cute. I love those.
Oh my God, those are amazing.
There you go. There's the forest spirit.
but I feel like that is a lot, and especially Witcher 3, when they open up the world, that, you know, you have the greater good, and then you have good, and you are immediately fed back if you're good or not. The big storyline with the werewolves and the Sylvans in the show, where like if you were a decent person or Witcher through the game, depended on the outcome of that, whether or not they attacked you and tried to kill you, or if they left you alone and kind of stuff for it. So I definitely see that as being a distinction in the Slavic and Witcher mythologies.
It's definitely a theme in the books and the show, but I like your point that in the game too, like a first-person role-playing game is great for that, where you get to make those hard decisions and then see what happens because of it.
I feel like also, though, an aspect that I notice in Slavic fairy tale a lot is this sort of random, chaotic feel that it really, and this is sort of expanding on what you've just been saying, it really doesn't have anything to do with good or evil. It just is kind of shit happens, you know. And you get all these stories, the sort of werewolf stories that are the guy wanders off into the wood, gets attacked, becomes a werewolf, comes back 10 years later to try and be reunited with the woman he loved, but ends up eating her. The end. And it's like, what? Where, you know, there isn't that seeking for a morality that you find in the more Western Northern Hemisphere fairy tales. It's often a sort of morality tale of, and the Wicked Witch was defeated, and the Disneyfication of the story. Whereas in the Slavic, it often is just, you know, we believe that there are these elemental forces out there, and there is darkness in the world. And frankly, you know, if you live in Russia, or that, you're probably experiencing a lot of darkness in those winter nights. And you do your best to defend yourself against it, and you hope that there are forces that will help you defend yourself. But it's not really a question of good and evil. And I love that even in the character of Geralt himself, that he is, if you like, the knight in shining armor. He's our best hope to defend us, and yet people hate him and fear him and don't want him around, and you know, he isn't hailed as a hero.
Well, if you see, he's kind of like in the U.S. we have in the National Weather Service we've got this one guy, Jim Cantori, and wherever Jim Cantori is, you do not want to be, because he's only there because things have gotten extremely bad. So while he's a great guy, you never ever want to see him come to your town. And I kind of get that sense from Geralt as well, is that, yeah, you may be a great guy, but at the same point, if you're here, that means something is deeply wrong. And that means a lot of people have to, like, you know, stop putting their heads in the sands and going, no, everything's fine. We lost 2 people last night, but everything's fine. So he's kind of like the living embodiment of, no, everything is not fine, and you're going to have to deal with that.
You know, he was treated like garbage for, you know, a long time, up until Dandelion helped with propaganda and tossing a coin to your Witcher kind of stuff for it. That up until that point, you know, he's a gruff jerk. People treat him like a gruff jerk, and there's a feedback loop of, we don't want the Witchers kind of stuff for, and because they're putting themselves out of business, you know, there's less and less monsters that need a Witcher kind of stuff.
Well, and there are also less and less Witchers because they've lost the ability, or they are blocked from the ability to create more Witchers. So, if I understood the show correctly. So then that also makes it a lot more interesting, because, you know, just like with the elves, you know, they're kind of an endangered species, because they're not fully human, they're not fully other, they're straddling the 2 worlds. So, and anything straddling the 2 worlds is automatically going to have the hardest time.
And I like how, like, you know, it kind of justifies why there's no Witchers now, you know, in 2020. It's because that happened, you know, 800 years ago, and they killed all the dragons, so now that we don't have dragons. You know, we're killing all the rhinos, and soon we won't have any rhinos.
I think even Geralt at one point kind of has a little discussion about that, how it's like he's destroying his own profession as he kills monsters. His job's to kill monsters, but the more monsters he kills, the less monsters there are to kill. And so it's like this catch-22 of like, what is he supposed to do? But he just, you keep on keeping on.
Yeah, unless Aretuza and Bernard start creating monsters, which would totally be within their wheelhouse. Yeah, I had fun looking at those.
You make them.
Yeah, I was just like, I'm like, oh yeah, there's so much you could unpack there with Aretuza and Bernard, and I love that we do get to see some of that with like some of their council meetings, where people just keep throwing like Stregobor's stuff straight back in his face. But yeah, it's really kind of fascinating, just the cycles, because I mean, if you think about it, at the end of season 1, King Foltest is coming to help the wizards or wizards, witches, whatever, because of the service that Geralt did for him. So it's kind of like you drop a pebble into a creek and you see all the ripples come out. So something that we might think is not even connected comes full circle, in which Foltest is coming to the aid of Aretuza, and simple things like that, like Pavoda, and like the law of surprise, which I can't actually find the law of surprise in a lot of Slavic mythology, and it could just be that I'm looking in all the wrong places. But that was interesting. Like that was truly fascinating. I'm like, wow, that's the perfect folklore thing, because it's theoretically neutral. It could be anything. Mm-hmm. And yet there's so many points in there where you're just like, wow, this could really screw something up for someone down the line.
I don't think that is a particularly Slavic tradition. And for me, that's, again, how there's so many, how Sapkowski weaves in so many different threads. The law of surprise, that one you get a lot in Greek mythology, a lot.
Yeah.
Like if I get safely home, I will sacrifice the first thing that meets me on the beach when I get home. So it goes back to those very ancient myths. It's not something that I've read in Slavic fairy tale particularly, but certainly you find it in Greek mythology a lot. Actually.
Yeah, you see it. Yeah, you do see it in Greek mythology. You see it also in the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament. But they don't necessarily, they haven't like codified it quite like Sapkowski did.
You see a lot of Rumpelstiltskin vibes as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's vibes of it in classical fairy tales and folklore all over, but to have it like specifically like codified like that, I had not seen that before, and I was just like, oh, well, okay.
I thought it was a good way for them to show, don't screw with destiny, or destiny's going to screw back with you.
Well,
yeah,
exactly, and that is a standard belief in pagan practice and witchcraft practice, that if you're making a deal, be very careful about how you word your deal, because things will be twisted, and you be careful what you ask for, because it will be fulfilled, but maybe not in the way that you hoped it was going to be fulfilled.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much, just typical human nature, isn't it? That all of these myths and beliefs and ideas come inherently from who we are as human beings, and that how we find that language can twist itself, and that things have a way of playing out.
You get another flavor with that with the Djinn episode and the Djinn part of the book, with Geralt and Yennefer and the Last Wish, the titular Last Wish.
Yeah, we also have a question.
We got one from Morgan P, and she's asking, what is the difference between Alps and Bruxa? Are they higher vampires? Now Bruxa, I've done a little bit around, and really they're just another form of witch, from my understanding. But go ahead, Bethany, if you have more, go for it.
I was going to say, Bruxa, those are more, because that's the South American term, or the Central and South American term for witches. And generally that's kind of, I mean, you have different flavors, I want to say, of different bruxaria, And you've got different, because someone who's a Santeria, whose practices Santeria is different from someone who is a more traditional bruja, depending on where you are, depends on how you say that. But in Brazil, a lot of that comes down to you're more like a general, almost hedge witch, in a sense. You're the person they go to when they need a resolution to this thing, like right now. So I'm not sure how they're categorizing that in this more Slavic sense, but
So for like the Witcher,
Go ahead, Seth.
you've got they're both like species of high vampires. So the stronger are the ones. If I remember right, the big difference between Alps and Bruxa was the Alps were from the north, and Bruxa are they're immune to the sunlight, so they can actually go out during the day, versus how some of the Alps and most of the lower or higher vampires, have that, where they can't go out in the sun, but the Bruxa definitely can, kind of stuff for it.
I mean, if I remember correctly too, in the book, one of the big ones we see the Bruxa is when you have that Beauty and the Beast with Niflheim, and he thinks his girl is Rusalka, which is a more, I guess, calm species, but it ends up being a Bruxa, and her and Geralt have a big brawl out in the yard. They're quite powerful.
And traditionally, again, obviously, Sapkowski uses these terms and defines the creatures in the way that he wants to. An Alp is from Germanic folklore originally, and is more of an incubus sort of type creature, but that has that vampiric quality.
Yeah.
Whereas Bruxa just meant a witch, just was somebody who practiced magic and didn't have traditionally any overtones of being a vampire, but obviously in The Witcher it takes on a different definition.
I always got the vibe too, and Seth, I don't remember, Kristen, if you said you'd played the games too, that I had more of a vampire vibe in the games versus in the books they had more of a witch vibe, just like a powerful witch even.
It's definitely like that. I think The Witcher, the games, the big difference is, just power level kind of stuff for it. Because, you do have to bend some stuff for a game. You can't have every vampire be, the same, because eventually you're going to get good and kill one,
Right.
and you'll kill all of them. So you need levels. I think that's where they got into like higher, level of kind of stuff for it, that, you can run across a Bruxa during the day and she will mess you up. Kind of stuff for it. Versus, the Alps was a little bit easier to fight, kind of stuff for it. Both are, I also want to say the Alps looked more like the fallen elf kind of thing for it, so they fell more into that category. Both were, silver sword to kill them. You had Quinn, who actually was able to, mess with one in the games and stuff like that. So it's definitely, I think, with the mythology, they're more like, witches, but in the game they did go more vampire-ish kind of stuff for it. Because you've also got the Striga, which would, technically be a vampire, but it's definitely different in the books and in the game.
Right.
Kind of stuff for it than the normal.
Yeah, again, and I haven't played the game, but again, the Striga in Last Wish certainly is very traditional, in that it's a woman who has been cursed and takes the form of a monstrous animal, and their actions are vampiric because it's feeding on humans, but it's in a way closer to a werewolf in the sort of traditional beliefs. So in the book, again, Sapkowski's using it quite traditionally, but it's so interesting to me. Again, all these different creatures. A lot of them are Germanic, and then you have the ones that are specifically Slavic, like the Rusalka that we mentioned before. But then he even has in there, like really early on in one of the books, just as mentioned, Spriggan. And Spriggan is a Cornish fairy. So, it's like Harry Potter, Cornish pixies.
That's what I thought of.
Right? And I love that he's got all those different elements in there. And Bethany, you were saying before that the elves are not Tolkien knockoffs, although I do think there's quite a lot in the elves that is reminiscent. But to me, the elves remind me most of Icelandic elf beliefs, and particularly in this idea of moving them off your land. And that in Iceland, there still is the belief that if there's a fairy mound, an elvish home, you do not move it, you build around it, you know. So that idea of having moved elves off their land and the strife that comes from that, to me is very reminiscent of the Icelandic. And yet the words that he uses, the names that he uses for elves, are very much Celtic. They're very Gallic in the structure of the words, like the Ansith, he calls them, which is like the Bensith or the Catesith, the Banshee, the cat fairy that you get in Gallic traditions. So again, it's that interesting mixture of all those different Northern Hemisphere elements.
I like that you referenced the Icelandic elves, because they're some of my favorite elves that, you know, you don't move them, you don't mess with them, give them a little bit of fruit and wine so they don't screw with you, and everyone will live in harmony kind of stuff for it. But
yeah. The other thing, sorry, Bethany, go.
Oh, you go ahead.
I was just going to say the other thing in The Witcher that reminds me a lot of Icelandic witchcraft beliefs is the signs that Geralt makes when he makes the sign of Ard, or a lot of Icelandic witchcraft is all about making runic signs to protect yourself. Probably the best known one is the Helm of Or, which I've seen people have that tattooed. I was standing in a line in the airport behind a guy who had the Helm of Or tattooed onto his elbow. And so that idea of kind of making sigil signs in the air that will protect you, those kind of talismanic signs, to me is very much part of Icelandic witchcraft that you don't get in a lot of other European witchcraft traditions. So I wonder if Sapkowski was aware of that when he was writing.
And then also with the magic, with the sorcerers, you get the, I'm going to toy the Full Metal Alchemist equivalent exchange that, if you're wanting to, do something like, in the show where we see her arm wither up and stuff like that. I like how they went that way with it, that there's a price to pay to use this magic kind of stuff for it. And then you've got like the signs where, the price of pay is actually spending the time to learn and, learn how to channel that kind of stuff for it. So I definitely like that too.
You get that great quote in the show from Tisaya where she's like, the best thing a flower can do for us is die. It's like that. It's like, I don't know, something about it that's so, even though it's a flower, it's just so dark that it definitely gives that Slavic vibe.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And a lot of like, and it's one of those things that I always love seeing that, because it means someone's actually really put some thought into their magical system. Especially because, magic is not an infinite resource. And it's a finite resource. Granted, there's quite a lot of it you can power up depending upon your flavor of witch or how you're channeling power, but there's always going to be a give and take. There is always going to be that give and take. Just as the first law of thermodynamics, energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be transformed. So you're essentially just moving the energy from this flower thing over to this other thing over here. But the other thing that we haven't quite touched upon yet is how much of it comes from Slavic mythology is mostly an oral tradition, which is why we do get a lot of these kind of like weird contradictions or holes or stuff like that, is because it's primarily all oral, and no one is ever going to tell the same story the same way twice. It just never happens. There's a detail.
Oh, sorry. I was gonna say, I'm really glad you brought that up, because that was gonna be what I wanted to talk about next, was just kind of the chaotic nature of this mythology, where I think a lot of people, especially when you're taught in school, you have these like pantheons of here's who's who in this mythology, where you don't have that as much in Slavic mythology. Yes, there's gods, and we know more about it, but there's a lot of oral tradition being passed down, mixed, You even see it with just like the countries in Eastern Europe, the Slavic countries and their history. But go ahead. I'm so glad you brought it up.
Yeah, just because, and that's like, we can't really like negate that, because that makes a lot of what's in the Witcher show make a lot more sense once you kind of understand that idea, is that this is all coming from a primarily oral tradition. So you have some certain standards, some certain like linchpins, but then, you know, it's going to vary from country to country, from town to town.
Mhm.
And that's kind of, I think, why also it ties back into your individual kindness, your individual generosity, because of that oral tradition. So we don't know, this spirit could be good for you and bad for me, and
Yes.
we need a reason why, so here's the reason why.
Yeah, a lot of the
So,
Slavic tales can be very local.
Yeah.
And you can see that with the northern kingdoms in The Witcher, where you have these fragmented kingdoms that have a lot of similarities, but there are also a lot of differences, very similar.
yeah, and then I also love it continues to crack me up that people keep talking about like Sintra, and they keep refusing our mages, and yet I'm like sitting here going, I'm like, and in every scene that Queen Calanthe is in, just about, we see Mousak, the mage. So it kind of makes me question. I'm like, okay, guys, is it that they don't want a mage, or is it that they don't want a mage controlled by you?
I definitely think it's not a mage controlled by you, because Mousak has a lot of virtue and morals that some of the other sorcerers and mages don't necessarily have. Like, he was all about actually doing what Cetra needed, not what the hive mind back at home was telling him to do, kind of stuff. Because they would have likely wanted Ciri turned over immediately to them, versus letting her run off and do her own thing, kind of stuff for it. And I kind of want to mention the whole, like, how we have the oral tradition for Slavic. It's also kind of mirrored in the Norwegian, Odin and the Vikings kind of stuff, where a lot of their stuff is handed down verbally, to where we don't know a lot. So, like, if we don't have a lot on Odin, except for, like, I think like 10 stories that have been written down. But then you have the Roman and Greek gods, where someone can come up and write Lore Olympus, and someone can immediately pick it up and immediately know who each god is and what they represent, because it is so heavily ingrained in the society to know those pantheons more than which Slavic kind of stuff, which they have, but I also feel like Slavic doesn't put a lot of stress in like gods kind of stuff for it. It's each has their own little realm that they work in. Like the Leshens are forest spirits, but they're not necessarily considered like forest gods. And I think really the only essence is Shinobog, or Shinobog, or how.
Chernobog?
Yeah.
Chernobog?
Like, I think he's one of the only mentioned gods in the game. And he's mentioned a couple times in the books kind of stuff for it. But I think there is a real difference between the oral versus the written that we get.
That also comes from what was permitted in a society. So when you're talking about Greek and Roman myth, you're talking about civilizations that were highly sophisticated and intellectual, and recorded their own history and tales and beliefs that were universally part of that society, and that were the established beliefs. And when you talk about Slavic witchcraft, for example, a lot of, in Europe, we're talking often about the Dark Ages, when these beliefs were sort of strongly held and therefore not written down. These are beliefs that were systematically wiped out by invaders, whether in Britain it was the Druids being wiped out by the Romans, or whether much later it's witchcraft believed local traditions being wiped out by Christianity. In Slavic countries, you actually get an interesting blend of Christianity with witchcraft. So, and you don't see this in The Witcher. The Witcher is very definitely a pagan society. It is not a Christian society at all. But actual traditional Slavic witchcraft is kind of like voodoo in the way that it blends Christian saints with pre-Christian beliefs and comes up with this new mixture there. But if you are practicing something and believing something that the hierarchy tells you is forbidden, you're not going to write it down. You hand it down orally, you know, and even in The Witcher, in the books themselves, you have that fascinating episode where they go to the town, and I've forgotten where it is now, but where there's the book that tells them about the different magical creatures, and there's the one wise woman of the village who has the book, but she doesn't know how to read it. She's just been taught orally what the pictures in the book represent, you know. And again, it's that sense of arcane knowledge that is A, too precious to be liberally shared, and B, too clandestine and dangerous to be written down. And so it has to be preserved orally as the only safe way of doing it. And I think that's very evident in the traditions that The Witcher is taking from.
Well, and that seems like a good segue to bring up kind of like what I brought up to us like before we went live is thinking about when some of these stories were written by Sapkowski and how that kind of filtered in, because I believe some of the earlier stories were written in 1986 and the Berlin Wall was still up. We still had a USSR. So a lot of that kind of filters into some of the struggles there, like some of the struggles with the elves, being forced to move and being like persecuted like up to extinction. And you saw a lot of that you did see a lot of that in the Cold War, especially on the other side of the Iron Curtain. And that's something that I feel like comes through really well in the show. You definitely get that vibe when Geralt is talking to Filavandrel and talking about different things, and I'm like, yeah, this is not just a people, you know, being forced to move, but this is like a whole on like cultural and social like genocide. They are being forced to move. They're being forced to abandon like everything. And it's the whole convert or die sort of situation that you see a lot with in the colonial oppression. So it's really fascinating to kind of see some of that history filtered out through the show.
You pretty much described Nilfgaard, right? Like it's like in the book, like they definitely go for those themes.
Yeah, and Nilfgaard is like some weird blend of like the USSR and like China and the US and Rome, and like it's picking from like all of these really big major nations. And their emperor reminds me of somewhere between like a blend of like Constantine and let's see, some of the czars like from Russian history, where you're just like, oh, you're on a crusade, you know, you're on a mission from God. This is your mission from God. Okay, great, fantastic.
And you see them come in and they're crushing that individuality and some of that chaotic in the traditions of the northern kingdoms.
Yeah,
I think it's a definite like obvious parallel for, you know, Nilfgaard coming in and crushing those kingdoms. And like you said, I see USSR, I see Rome, I see a lot of you think of just coming in and those smaller towns, those nations, those villages, and kind of crushing their local traditions. So the question over here, again from Morgan. Thank you, Morgan. We appreciate your questions today. And she asks, are griffins considered noble creatures in The Witcher? It seems that griffins are seen as such in other literature, but are terrifying in the Witcher universe. Anyone want to talk about griffins?
I can a little bit. So for like griffins, there's such a heraldic symbology that, you know, the Egyptians have their own folklore on griffins. You know, European, you know, people used them as coat of arms. For The Witcher, in Slavic culture, you know, they symbolize fighting, courage, and like victory kind of stuff for it. And I think while that's what the Griffins is, the games decided to take a little bit of, creative monstering of them, just because, like I said, a game needs monsters for you to fight. And so forth. And if I remember right, the Griffins were kind of dumb creatures that you could trick and trap kind of stuff for it. So they definitely took them as just being monsters versus being, the eagle side of nobility and the lion side of ferociousness kind of stuff. I just wanted to mix it.
And again, with them being used as heraldic devices and stuff, we tend to have this more shiny rose-colored glasses mythologized vision of the Griffins, and I'm like, no, guys, if you see one in real life, they're going to terrify the crap out of you.
Yeah, I would not want to be anywhere near one.
Like,
I'm glad Geralt killed them all, so I don't have to deal with them.
like they're going to terrify the crap out of you. So I'm like, don't
I'd be
lose sight.
surprised at the very least if I saw one in real life. I definitely would be surprised,
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a fun fact. My family crest has a griffin in it.
Oh, how cool.
There you go. But yeah, they definitely were seen as, it's a bit like hippogriffs in Harry Potter. They're seen as noble beasts, but with the capacity to be ferocious and courageous and violent and aggressive. But they're seen as being sort of brave leaders, and that's why they end up being used in heraldry a lot, say. But yeah, as you were saying, Seth, they seem to have been kind of reduced quite a lot in The Witcher to much more just sort of scrappy, fierce fighting things without that sense of nobility and leadership. But that goes back to what we were talking about before, about the sort of Slavic tradition, that things aren't inherently noble or inherently good. They're just creatures. And if you encounter them in the wrong situation, they're going to eat you. And if you encounter them in the right situation, they might help you out. But they're just things that exist. It's much, although obviously they're mythical creatures, in a way it's much closer to reality. Things are neither inherently good nor inherently evil.
I don't think that they didn't show a griffin at all in season 1.
No.
So we haven't seen how the show, which likely they're going to have to show one in season 2 or 3 eventually. But you talk about like the monsters that they did show, like the Sylvan was my favorite of all the mythology from season 1 kind of stuff for it, because they, especially listening to the audio book for Last Wish, it was just amazing. That whole chapter with him going back and forth and dandying words with Geralt, that you're just as bad as I am, and I just want to eat, and I can still this stuff, and I definitely can't grow it because I'm one Sylvan by myself. So I'm gonna hit Jasker over here in the head with a lead ball because it'll be hilarious. So.
Well, and
Go ahead.
sorry. Oh, I was just gonna say, and something else that the show kind of hints at. It doesn't really come out right and state it really blatantly, but magic is dying. Like in the world, magic is dying. So that also probably contributes a lot to some of these creatures who, we were used to thinking of as noble and really wise and all this stuff. And, magic is dying, so they're not at the same capacity as they used to be. So that's definitely also a factor there.
And that could also work with the Griffins too. That
Yeah.
5 or 10 generations before Witcher 3, they could have been actual smart and intelligent creatures, but they're falling to their baser instincts in just defending themselves from being murdered. Because a griffin is an animal, and just like the dragons, they're hungry, they've got to eat, and humans grow cattle, and humans can technically be cattle to them, because if a 50-foot long dragon decides to have me for lunch, there's not much I can do about it. Same with a griffin. And so that's why we have the witchers killing them and the witchers driving them to extinction kind of stuff, because humans don't like what we don't understand.
Yeah. And there's kind of a sort of sick irony in the sense that the witchers have been hunting these creatures to extinction, and now the witchers themselves are becoming extinct. So that's, again, it just cycles. It all comes back to cycles.
Well, we got 10 minutes left, so I thought it would be fun. And you can have multiple answers if you want to talk about our favorite creatures, especially if they have a Slavic origin, and kind of describe them and discuss them. Oh, and before we do, I do have one question that just came in from Kate. Hi, Kate. Do you think the world building properly accounts for society existing in parallel with all the monsters in the world? So we can talk about that for a minute.
I do. I do, because I think we coexist now with a lot of things that we maybe aren't always aware of or don't acknowledge appropriately, or you know, it's the whole "there are more things in heaven and earth" Horatio than are dreamt of in your philosophy, you know, that. And remember that in real life, not in fantasy, people believed and still believe in a lot of things. We're talking about Icelandic elves. There are still people in Iceland who believe that you absolutely have to build around a fairy mound. You cannot build a road through it. And in Poland, witch trials and witch persecution went quite a lot later than in a lot of Europe. In the eastern areas, it through into the mid 18th century. So you're talking about peaking around 1725, and we think very much that we're in modern era by the time you get to 1725. I mean, you're heading towards the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and you know, so that people still absolutely believed that courts existed. And you know, the last person to be prosecuted on witchcraft charges in Britain was during the Second World War. So, and that was partly that they used it as a way of prosecuting somebody. But nonetheless, the witchcraft statute still existed in British law and was used as recently as the Second World War. So our society, our real world society, exists in parallel with all kinds of beliefs and creatures and amazing animals, and you know, things in Madagascar and in Australia, incredible creatures. So I don't have any issue with the witches' world being filled with beliefs and superstitions and powers and monsters, just in the way that our world is.
Yeah, I think we kind of see a very interesting thing with Nilfgaard being, you know, trying to purposely not exist parallel to these monsters. You know, when I think about the individual kingdoms, they're gonna, you know, get along with what they can get along with and just, you know, move on with life, while Nilfgaard is, you know, purposely trying to drive these things to extinction, run the elves out of town, not deal with any of these kind of stuff for it. And I think that's kind of paralleled almost now to the 21st century, how, you know, I don't want to get into like humans bad kind of stuff for it, but, you know, global climate change, stuff like that, you know, I think he represents Nilfgaard a little bit into that too, that they're the force of change that's happening in the Witcher world, and they're spreading out, and, you know, they don't want to exist parallel to these things.
I have another question in the chat. It's from Isaac. Hi, Isaac. Concerning cycles, if magic is dying out, should we expect to complete some kind of cycle wherein magic comes back someday?
Well,
that's a great question.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, that kind of comes down to how are you defining magic? Because there's, I mean, in the world of The Witcher, I mean, yeah, absolutely, there could be something where where magic comes back. I'm pretty sure you'd have to raise Aretuza and Banard to the ground first, and then build it back up, because they've got that kind of pool of unfiltered chaos stuff. But yeah, that's absolutely possible. Whether we'll see that in the show or in the books or in the games, that I don't know. But in the real world, yeah, I mean, again, the famous quote, "There are more things in heaven and earth," Horatio. I mean,
Witcher also has like the conjunction of the spheres, so we don't really know what's going to happen. Magic brought the humans here,
right?
And you know, if it's every like 500 years, then we can eventually expect another conjunction to happen to bring another magical, you know, creature who could then drive the humans to extinction very easily. Dwarves this time around, or, you know, actual Tolkien elves kind of stuff running around. traveling west could be just the conjunction of spirits coming over the Witcher.
Yeah.
But I definitely think there could be a cycle where magic will come back, and
Yeah.
and the Witchers will come back as a result of it, and it'll just lead in a big, what Hopper would like to say, a weird wheel of time kind of thing.
Yeah.
I was going to mention the conjunction of the spheres as well, that it happened once and brought all of this together. Basically, different dimensions and worlds collide, monsters, magic, humans come into the elves' world, and that's where we are in The Witcher, is hundreds of years later. But it could happen again and refresh itself in a new way.
Yeah.
It's like New England weather. If you don't like it, just wait. Something better will happen in a minute.
Totally. So we're at our 5-minute warning. So now I think we have time if we want to go around and say our favorite creature. It could be, witch, whatever, but your favorite part of magical creatures, magic powers, whatever, from the books or show. Kirsten, you want to go first?
All right, sure. Well, my favorite feature of the book is how much it is imbued with actual witchcraft belief. So I love how accurate Sapkowski's herbology is, for example. I'm going to use that as my short answer. I love how accurate he is in what different plants are used for. He has the right ones for exorcisms, for purification. He's really done his research there. Occluded gemstones, stones with a hole in being used for fertility, etc., etc. Whether you think any of that stuff has any basis in reality or not, those are real beliefs. And I love that his characters, and specifically Geralt himself as the Witcher, is very much a real pagan, using nature, using the elements, using the herbs in the way that pagans do. And that, to me, that gives a sort of realistic core to these fantasy stories.
Awesome. Seth, what about you?
I kind of mentioned it earlier, but the Leshen is my favorite because my background is actually zoology, and so I'm a fan of animals and the forest kind of stuff for it, and anything with a forest spirit I really appreciate and I like, because with the forest spirit they're usually always ambiguous, that if you do good by them they'll do good by you, and then if you're like in Princess Mononoke and you do bad by the forest spirit, bad stuff happens. Kind of stuff for it. And that's why Miyazaki is also Princess Mononoke is my favorite Miyazaki film. It's because they have the forest spirits, but that's definitely my favorite of all the monsters, and they, I think, look some of the coolest looking ones in the game. Kind of stuff for it.
Bethany, what about you?
Oh man, is this either favorite monster or favorite magic thing? Because I think my favorite magic thing is just all the monsters are my favorite monsters. That's for sure. I prefer actual monsters than the human-shaped monsters. I am super biased. But especially the ones that are just like live and let live. But no, I love that the magic, quote unquote, is channeling the chaos kind of in the air, in the world and stuff. That for me is like, no, if you're going to make huge fundamental shifts, like changing, if you're changing like biology, changing yourself, you're tapping into a lot of chaotic energy. So I think that was probably one of my favorite parts. But yeah, no, I love all the monsters. All the monsters are the best.
Yeah, they're all great. If I had to pick one, I'd probably with Kristen. I love the witches. I love how they use chaos, like you were saying, Bethany, the give and the take. But those are always my favorite parts of the book or the show whenever we get to see more sorceresses. Well, we're 1 minute till 11, so we're going to close out. But I wanted to give you guys a chance, if you're on any other panels that you'd like to mention, or just where people can find you if they want to follow more of what you're doing. Kristen, you going to go first?
I'm actually on the next panel up. At
awesome.
11:30, it's the OneRing.net's annual DragonCon panel. We'll be looking back on the last 12 months of Tolkien fandom and looking forward to what's to come. And actually, there's a lot. So if you want to know what there is to look forward to in Middle-earth fandom, don't miss the OneRing.net's panel coming up at 11:30.
Great. Seth, what about you?
I have a Cosmere speculation panel That'll be a little bit about Rhythm of War from Brandon Sanderson tomorrow at 5:30. And that'll be it for me this year.
Bethany, how about you?
I am moderating the Westworld Season 3 panel for the American Sci-Fi Science Fiction and Fantasy Media. I'm also doing Truly Outrageous Women of Sci-Fi for the Sci-Fi Classics track tomorrow at around 1, 2, depending on your time zone. And then I'm also doing a super special panel at 7 a.m. tomorrow morning, which is going to be talking a lot about just, families and fandom and like the generations of nerd and how that comes about. So, and then, gosh, I'm forgetting something.
You have a lot going on.
I always have a lot going on. I think this is the first year I'm under 12 panels.
Oh, wow.
For like the last 5-6 years. But you can find me either on Facebook under my actual name, Bethany Kesler. You can find me on Twitter at Dorothy Joan Gray. And then my website is deejgray.com. And it's got my blog. It's got links to my Patreon for my short stories and all my other social media on there. So that's me.
Great. I will be having a panel today at 1. I'll be a panelist. I will not be moderating, but we'll be talking about the trickster trope in Game of Thrones. And then tomorrow at 1, we'll be predicting what will happen in the Winds of Winter if we ever live to see the publication of Winter. And other than that, I post my cosplays on Instagram at Chewbacca Cosplay. But I just want to thank everyone who joined us today. Thank you for tuning in. Thanks for all your questions. This was a lot of fun. Thank you guys for being panelists. And I hope you guys check out more of High Fantasy at DragonCon's panels this weekend. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you, guys.
Right,
Oh, you're welcome.
Everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
And I think it'll last 20 seconds.
Yeah, 20 more seconds from that. That was a pretty good panel. I like mythology.